So, hello and welcome back to Brick by Brick, which is a podcast produced by the Heritage Network's Youth Forum and our podcast subgroup. This episode, we are going to be talking a little bit about skill sets and specialising or having more general skill sets, what the advantages and disadvantages might be, and kind of what we think about hard and soft skills and kind of just a little bit of discussion around skills and what you might need in heritage, how they can be applied, and how you maybe can come by them and develop them for yourself as well. This episode, you're joined by myself, Izabella Marr, and
Darcie,
Kate,
Becca, Elizabeth.
We also have, or this episode, we have Sophie. Sophie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you for listening. I'm Sophie. I'm the Heritage Trainee for England for the Heritage Network. It's my first time recording with this podcast, so I'm very excited to get stuck in today.
Fab, thank you, Sophie. So, the kind of broad topic for this episode is that kind of broad or specific skills and knowledge. And do we think that more broad or specific skill and knowledge sets are more useful within heritage? And also kind of what skills are needed and skills mapping and a little bit about that. So does anyone have anything they would like to say first?
I'd like to speak first if that's all right. So coming into this, I think it was really interesting to kind of have a look at that skills mapping, and having looked at a variety of different areas and different career bases, and we kind of came together and kind of found 5 main sections, although they're obviously much more specialised careers and much more interesting roles that we'd never heard of. And to break it down into those 5 sort of key sections, we firstly focused on sort of the main, like classical, I guess you'd call it, or traditional type of heritage. And this is involving museums and archive services. And we broke it down a little bit further into a smaller strand of if you're an archaeologist, a heritage manager, museum and gallery creation, and collections manager. I feel like those are all, very clear management and administration like areas. And then we also looked at conservation and preservation, which is more about that kind of scientific side. So they have conservation scientists, preservation specialists, and archivists as well. Moving more towards the research and interpretation side, there was discussion about research and historians as well as historic building inspectors. And finally focusing a bit more on local history and family history. There was also a strand about genealogists. Then there was museum education as well and exhibition designing, which I find is more focused in the visitor engagement and education side. And that also looks at learning and outreach and those roles that are more engagement focused. And then finally, we looked at the final strand, which was the built heritage and architectural heritage side, much more surrounding those architectural roles, conservation roles, building surveillance, and traditional construction trades and craftspeople. But obviously this list is completely not exhaustive. We kind of covered a whole range there. So I don't know if anyone wants to add in specific roles and talk about their own experience of those specialised roles.
So I come from it from a different point of view, mainly because my degree wasn't actually within heritage at all. It was a language. I learned Welsh as a second language, which was my degree. And it's kind of a bit of a paradox in the sense that I've got a general skill in Welsh language, which has been really, really beneficial for me, in particularly within the heritage sector within Wales, because it's a really key skill in a lot of different areas of the heritage industry in Wales, such as learning, events, development, translation, and engagement, community engagement as well. Having that sort of general language skill is really important if you build a career in Wales, but also from an outside Wales perspective, it's a very specialist skill as well, because obviously it's not used as widely outside of my country. So I've got the slight sort of paradox thing of having a very general skill where I am based in that I've got like the skill set of language, whereas if it was in the rest of the UK, that skill set might not be as utilized, and it is a bit more of a specialist tool within like my sort of skill set. I also think as well there's a little bit of, I don't know if you'll feel the same way when they're sort of debating the two, whether to go and gather more broad experience or go more special, is that like imposter syndrome creeps into both, no matter what you do, because you might go down the one path of having a really specialist expertise in something, but you then maybe get those feelings of imposter syndrome because you feel like, oh gosh, why haven't I developed myself in other areas as well? Like I'm selling myself to a very limited scope. Whereas conversely, on the other hand, if you do the general, the imposter syndrome also creeps in there because you think, oh, I should really specialize because that really makes me stand out in front of the crowd. So I think the debate about whether to do one or the other does really have a big impact on young people, because I think young people really do suffer from imposter syndrome a lot. But I think what someone can really do is just sort of follow their instinct in terms of what they want to do. If you've got a really strong passion in one particular area or just a really keen interest, you'll be much happier exploring that rather than possibly going somewhere that you just doesn't excite you as much. And there's always time to broaden your experiences later on in your career if you can.
I definitely second that, Kate. I think it's so important to go in and follow your kind of gut instinct, as you say. If you enjoy it and it's something you're passionate about, I think exploring that avenue first, whether that's kind of niche or whether that's kind of more broad and general, you will probably find a better path for yourself following that kind of instinctive route than worrying too much about, oh no, but I don't have this skill, and oh no, but I don't have that skill. Because as you say, you will pick things up kind of as you traverse through your career, and you may find yourself in one position in your career thinking, oh, I'm going to specialize in this role, and then actually that role widens up other opportunities and you generalize in others, and you kind of really bounce off those different kind of paths. So I think definitely going in, I think that, as you said, there's benefits to both, but I think even if you go in niche, you're not necessarily pigeonholed for life. There is always opportunities to broaden your experiences, whether that's through kind of doing things outside of kind of work or within your work position as well. So I don't think in that sense there's too much pressure to decide and think, oh gosh, this is it for life, which I think is always quite important to bear in mind.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, my degree was in Welsh and I had the opportunity, and it was something I was looking at potentially, was doing a translation specific master's in Welsh language. Life turned out that I just didn't end up doing that for, various different reasons. And, I thought that would really sort of take me out of the options for doing very specific things with the Welsh language. But actually, I've ended up working in the translation department within my organisation anyway, not doing loads of translation myself because it is a very specialist skill set, but I still ended up there and the team are really supportive. So I have been doing like little bits here and there, and it's, that sort of idea like, oh gosh, the road I should have taken, that you kind of end up where you want to be a lot of the time anyway. And because you didn't go have like an arrow straight path, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's like the journey, not the destination a lot of the times, and you end up where you want to be a lot of the time.
Absolutely. I think as well in kind of my experience of where I am now, quite early careers, but I did quite general for kind of undergrad, and then I specialised a bit more in my master's doing landscape history. People always kind of go, oh, that's quite niche. But actually within that, it's quite broad. You cover quite a broad range of things. And then actually the job that I'm doing now does touch upon my skills that I learned in my master's, and part of the reason I got the job is because of my master's, but I'm learning a lot more, and I'd say I'm more broad now than what I originally kind of specialised in, so to say. So I think it's definitely quite interesting how you can kind of go quite niche and then broaden out, and you'll still find if you take that kind of niche route, those skills will be utilised even if you're doing them in a more general sense, if that kind of makes sense.
That makes sense.
So I have kind of two things, I guess, to add to everybody's points. I think in terms of like specialisation and I suppose the imposter syndrome thing that you were talking about there, Kate, with, should I go more broad but then do I have enough specific skills that will get me a job, or if I go too specific, is it going to rule out a lot of things? I think for a lot of people, there's probably that feeling of like, oh, well, I'll get to a certain point and it'll be a bit like a tipping point, and then suddenly I'll just know as much as I need to know. And I think that's maybe the wrong way to think about it, in that it's not like a seesaw that suddenly tips and you go, oh, well, now all of these jobs are open to me. I think it's more like a path that you walk down that has many forks, and at some point you make a decision, and you go down one fork, but it doesn't mean that you can't go back and go down another one, or that that first fork won't maybe lead round to another decision somewhere else. And it's, sorry to overextend a metaphor there, but I think it is that kind of thing of, just because you go to specialise in one thing or don't, doesn't mean that you won't end up at the place that you wanted to be, which I think is kind of the point that you were making anyway. But it is, yeah, that thing of, don't assume that you either have to or don't have to specialise. I think there's a lot that can be said for trying things out, seeing where a decision leads you, and then you can always kind of go back on that decision or make another one further down the path where you go, well, actually, I do want to specialise in that other thing now because I've learned a bit more about where this is going, and I think I would maybe prefer the other path or the other route. And then my other point was, I think in heritage, potentially, there are a lot of skills that might seem like they're specialist but can be kind of broadly applied to a lot of different roles. Things like interpretation, research, communications, even things like copy editing and marketing get used in so many different parts. There's different elements of jobs. Whether you're somebody that's doing, say, field work, you might still have to write a report. You might still have to do research. You might then have to do that if you're, say, putting together a presentation for something completely different, or going into a role where you have to do research on collections and interpretation for different artifacts, or kind of more cultural heritage where it's specifically interpretation and maybe not so many artifacts. You still have to have that kind of way of thinking about it, and explaining the heritage behind it. And that all of those skills, when you say them, might seem quite niche or specialist, but actually can be applied in many places, I think.
Just to build on what you said, Izzy, as well, what you were saying was just making me think as well that, depending on like your life circumstances as well, having the opportunity to specialize in certain skill sets comes with like a bit of privilege. You know, you like the means, particularly if it was something like a master's degree, or you know, you have the time in order to do volunteering in order to gain those specialist skills. So I was going to say that if people do have the opportunity to do so, that is absolutely fantastic. But I think it should be encouraged for people within the industry now to have these next generations, and be open to those people who have maybe a more broad range of experiences, not the specialist key skill set, because I think that does discourage a lot of people, particularly young people, to go into heritage. The sort of, you know, this sort of idea of a sort of a veil of sort of middle class industry, which it can be a lot of the times, and with and not everyone has the privilege of money, opportunity, time in order to gain those more specialist skill sets that may be seen as essential in those entry level jobs, or like those initial jobs where someone could apply for something. I think leaders need to be more open to the idea that people come in with a range of different skills, and if they need to specialize, they can specialize in-house with like supportive training and supportive opportunities for someone to build.
And even things like apprenticeships, and kind of, you can get, I suppose, I think for a while there was a move away from apprenticeships as a kind of format for early careers, and I think within heritage it's starting a kind of resurgence again. I know that some of the larger heritage organisations are maybe not implementing super widely apprenticeships, but I know that places like Historic England are trying to do more kind of that early careers. You're not expected to have all the skills when you get there level of apprenticeships, and I think that that's a really good mode of doing it. And it is also often those roles, or that kind of format of learning, can lead to very specific sets of skills. I know that specifically within kind of heritage crafts, it's the more used format is that kind of apprenticeship, because you have to learn from somebody who knows how to do it. There's only so much kind of theory learning that you can do for some sets of skills, and you do have to kind of be in an environment where you can develop those hands-on skills that you need for very specific things like stained glass windows and stonemasonry and all of the really cool heritage crafts that there are that I sometimes, lament not being able to do. But I do have a much more general skill set, I think. And I suppose my specialisms will be more in terms of kind of, I suppose, management, outreach, and events management, which is a lot of what I do in my day-to-day job. But I do, yeah, a little part of me itches to be able to do cool heritage crafty things. But that's maybe one day I'll get the opportunity and can go and do that. That would be really cool.
It's never too late to change your career path and pursue new ventures.
Maybe one day I'll be like, I've done enough organizing of events and conferences and things now. It's time for me to go and try and learn how to make stained glass, because I think that's the one that I would enjoy the most.
Definitely.
Going along with what Izzy said about, specifically with the heritage sort of building crafts, where there's only so much you can learn in theory, and you have to really be hands-on. That's especially true for those types of specialized skills. But in my experience, it's also true to some degree for all the other jobs in heritage. Taking sort of inspiration from my own experience, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in history because it was what I was passionate about, and I was told it was broadly applicable, whether it was in the heritage field or not. I ended up getting laid off in early 2021 from my job in marketing. And I just basically took that as an opportunity for, well, you've always wanted to work at a historic site. They're hiring like entry-level customer-facing, like tour guide interpretation roles, part-time. Why not go for it? See if they'll hire you and see how you like it. Because prior to that, I didn't really know very much about all the different kind of careers in heritage, like this breakdown that Sophie was able to give, like these are the different areas. Like I had no idea. I knew about the historians they would interview for the documentaries they would show us in class at school. And then I knew about archaeologists, and then I knew about like people who vaguely worked in museums, but I didn't really know much more than that. And having the opportunity, my advice to people would be, if you see an entry-level job and it's a customer-facing role, it's giving tours, it's selling tickets in a shop, don't think, oh, I'm not going to learn anything from doing that. That would be a waste of my time. Like, there's a good chance it won't. I worked at several historic sites in America before I came here to the UK to do my master's. And my experience working at those historic sites were completely invaluable, because even though my job was just an entry-level tour guide job, I got to see up close and personal just how a historic site runs and all the moving parts and all the different departments. And I was able to ask my coworkers and people working in different departments, so what is it that you do? What skills did you need in order to get there? How did you get to where you were? And it's from that experience that I learned more about ultimately what I wanted to do, because I enjoy interpretation. I liked talking to people. I liked giving tours, but something I discovered was it's not the only thing I want to do in my career. I also want to be creating the tours. I want to be designing the exhibits. I don't want to just be regurgitating sort of what I'm told. And so I started asking my supervisors and the interpretation managers, what was your path? How did you get to where you were? And ultimately, that was what led me to decide that getting a master's degree was worth the time, the energy, the money, the resources in order to be able to reach that goal. So my main advice would be, there are often unforeseen gifts and benefits. There's so much you're going to learn, even from just quote unquote an entry-level job. And if it's something that sounds interesting to you, and I'd encourage you to take it and just see what you can learn.
That's such an interesting perspective, Elizabeth. I feel like as someone who also didn't start in the heritage sector at all, coming from a background in finance, I really spoke with some of those, with my own experiences and how that affected my experience of coming into a world which, as you say, sometimes feels like there's just the sort of front of house roles that are available to you, and those, sort of highly prized curatorial or educational roles are very much owned and managed by a very small number of people who've managed to get in, sort of 10, 20 years ago and not able to move much further than that. So yeah, I definitely think that, as you say, like thinking about how you can expand your skills, talking to other people who can really give you advice on how their experience has been, and also find sort of those niche opportunities to try out new things as well. Actually, a similar example, a friend of mine had a similar experience where she worked in an entry-level role, primarily as a volunteer first in a local museum. And of course, you think kind of similarly that it's so generalized, you can hardly find your niche, you can hardly find the skills that are applicable to you. But actually, she was really fortunate and did pretty much exactly as you did, and asked us around her how she could progress and understand more. She then was given a part-time role, and after succeeding and really helping the museum to run, she was then offered a part-time master's degree over 2 years. She's just coming to an end, as in just gone this August. So she's just finished her thesis, and her part-time master's also was fully funded by the Institute. So she really, obviously proved herself in terms of her hard work and her effort, but also, as you say, because of that real dedication to understanding, okay, what about my career is going to be focused on those opportunities, and what kind of aspects of my heritage career appeals to me, what doesn't appeal. She mentioned that tour guiding was tough for her because of that exact thing of not being able to be that person behind the scenes. But something she really enjoyed was being able to show people collections that were not immediately available all days of the week. It was once or twice a year we would bring out some special exhibitions, and that really appealed to her. She's actually now moving to Germany and doing a similar research project there. And again, something so interesting about how you can become so specialized from such a general beginning. So I think her Germany heritage endeavours should be really good and really interesting. Another way to break into the heritage career in a completely different way.
Yeah, I would also say, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot as a recent graduate with my master's, I feel like there are some people, these people in my experience, they tend to be older generations where it's like, you get this bachelor's degree and then you get this master's and you talk to these people and you go down this checklist, you're going to get a job guaranteed and it's going to be great and you're not going to have to worry about anything ever again. And that's not true in the heritage field. And I don't think it's true for most industries in the current landscape anymore. Like the world just moves too fast, things change too quickly. And so I would tell people, don't stress about finding the quote unquote perfect path for you to get where you think you want to go, because there is no perfect path. It's a combination of education, experience, making connections, also just pure luck, being in the right place at the right time where they happen to have an opportunity for someone with your skill set. It takes a little bit of all of those things. So follow your instincts, do the best you can, and you kind of got to cross your fingers and hope for the best sometimes because there's no guarantees. Yeah, again, going with that theme of imposter syndrome, like, oh, someone else, they made better choices than I did, or they picked a better trackway. And it's like, okay, well, maybe that path worked for them. Everyone's path is unique and yours might be a little different, and that's completely 100% okay. What makes you unique in this heritage field is also what makes you an asset. And so don't compare yourself to other people too much.
And you can take advantage of like coming trends or like increasing importance and skill sets that are happening within the heritage sector. If it's in your interests, like definitely look at how you can maybe get like experience within things like sustainability within heritage sector, because that is becoming something that a lot of organizations, big and small, are trying to do their best at, and are looking for those people who have some of that skill or have a bit of knowledge behind them in order to be more sustainable within their practices. Things as well as like decolonization as well. That's a really important and not topic, because that belittles it too much, but a real big sphere of influence within the industry at the moment. It's somewhere that there's really interesting work that's going on. It's unveiling histories and discussions that just haven't happened before. So if you are able to gain some experience within that, put that on your CV in some way, that you volunteered or you supported, etc., that is something that would really stick out, and it's a skill that is going to get increasingly important within the sector, I feel like, personally. Yes, and also digital skills as well, because again, depending on where you are and depending on what area of heritage that you're looking to get into, like people have said in this podcast, that a lot of people in the industry right now have been there for years and got in really not with as much digital skill or the need to have that digital skill. So particularly smaller museums which are looking to, have a presence on social media, for example, are going to want people who are comfortable with that marketing side, with doing videos, with being comfortable on camera as well. Because a lot of people I know where I am, they are very happy to just not be behind the scenes, because that is their entire job. That's what they love doing. They don't really want to be on camera. They don't really understand, or it's not really their thing. Perfectly fine. But as a young person, if you can really take advantage of that, that really sticks out, because those people might not want to be on camera, but they recognise the importance of marketing, particularly for social media, for like smaller museums and smaller heritage centres.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to think about sort of like coming changes and how best we can represent sort of not the future of heritage, but maybe something about how young people can adapt and change heritage to really be something for everybody and not just sort of for a certain subsection. I suppose the thing is with the idea of specializing, so many young people have to be brilliant at everything to be able to be considered. I'm sure everyone's felt like this at some point, but I definitely think being digitally literate and sort of automatically being digitally like being able to help with website access or with marketing and communications, it almost feels as if there's a new level to meet, which previous generations may not have had that same sort of expectation. Don't know if anyone else has felt the same way with that.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I'm perfectly upfront. Marketing is not my strong suit. It's just not within my wheelhouse, but I can do it, and I've had to do it in jobs where it has been a real asset to be able to have those skills, even if I didn't particularly enjoy the tasks, just to be upfront about it. And I don't know if it's the same for everyone else, but a lot of those sort of initial jobs that you get in the sector do tend to be marketing or communications based, and I think there's a real push now for apprenticeships in marketing as well, depending on, the places that you're looking at. If you can be comfortable and you are comfortable doing it, I would say it's a real tool in your skill set to have. If it's not really your thing, then you're perfectly valid to just look at other avenues. But if you're comfortable being on camera, if you're comfortable with writing website copy, marketing, social media, I would say don't not consider it, if that makes sense.
I suppose the hardest thing really is with it being so general now to be able to have digital literacy and media skills. I find that the more specialist skills, for example, being able to create websites, develop apps, even, understand SQL and other data and potentially even create content in sort of coding form. I definitely think there's a large gap between those specialist skills which we see in other industries, for example, data analytics, that kind of thing, and that of the heritage sector. In fact, one of our trainees yesterday and today was at a conference, really interestingly, talking about how data management in heritage organisations is just not abysmal, but maybe definitely below the level expected. And it's a tough one because that's a very specialized skill set to be able to understand data analytics and to be able to use that well and to engage with a heritage career in that way. But in a way, it's almost like that is sort of missing from our heritage careers current list. I suppose in a way it might be something to consider in the future, how much more, specialist skill sets we can get in terms of the digital literacy.
You have to be more of a specialist in TikTok, I find, as well, because like more organizations get a TikTok account. You need to be able to be comfortable with that, like as an app, and using that to create content. Like that's a change from like 5 or 6 years ago, where it was more like Twitter and Instagram, where you had to create that sort of content. So yeah, it changes all the time. So it's a really good point, Sophie, that particularly in marketing, where things do change a lot of the time, and you need to be on trend and ahead of trends in order to create them. So
I think there's within the heritage sectors, maybe specifically, there's some kind of skills gaps and slight misconceptions around digital skills. And so I think there's a skills gap between kind of maybe previous generations who've operated within the heritage sphere and the level to which they need to have digital skills. And then there's a kind of assumption that young people who have more digital literacy and maybe more digital skills have the required digital skills to do all of the digital work that's needed. Whereas I think there's still specialisms within those kind of areas within the digital world, like you're talking about, Sophie, like some of the data management that's required, some of the specific marketing and communications skills that are required, that is kind of almost assumed and placed upon young people entering the sector, that they will just pick up the slack that has, or the gaps that need to be filled. So things like, I know that there are a lot of especially smaller and volunteer-run heritage organisations that maybe don't have a particularly digitized operating system or data management. And sometimes things like, I'm a trustee for a historical society where I live, and their records of the members are kind of barely digitized. I think there's a list somewhere, but some of it is probably still just written down in physical records. And it's only recently that they've switched to having kind of digital records of minutes and things like that. And so it's almost assumed that I, as a young person, can just do all of the things that need to be done. Luckily, not all of that is my job with it, or my role within that organization, but some of it is. And it's difficult almost trying to track down all of the different things that need to be updated, let alone actually updating them. And I think that that's maybe seen replicated kind of across the sector, and the level to which young people are maybe expected to fill those gaps is more than they do have the skills for, and the assumed skills are more than what they actually are, especially with things like communications marketing, because those are and can be very specialized roles. So as much as you might be, and I do think if you are comfortable doing those things and you are willing to learn on the job, they can be really fulfilling and they can be great. But it's also assumed that you can just like write a great post or a great news story or a great, kind of marketing piece of communications. Whereas actually that level of copy editing, writing, and writing for specific audiences is in itself a skill that not everybody has. And because you know how to maybe operate the website, it's assumed that you also know how to run it and promote it and do all of the other things. And I think sometimes there's a gap between those things. And I find sometimes that the assumptions that are placed upon us as young people who are early careers can be quite difficult to overcome, because it means that you maybe don't feel comfortable enough to ask for help or ask questions on where you need to develop skills, because the assumed knowledge that you have is so much that you don't want to suddenly go, oh, I actually don't know how to do this. Please, can you teach me? Or can you help me find training? Or so I think that can be really difficult in terms of skills development and in terms of kind of those concept of, I think because generally broadly we have those digital skills and that digital knowledge in a broad sense, it's assumed that we have those specialisms, and actually that can be hard to bridge the gap between. It can be really difficult to navigate that kind of how do you do your own skills audit around that, and how do you say, well, I do have some of these skills and I am willing to learn and I do want to do some of them, and yes, I'll be on camera, or yes, I'll write you a post, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to be the best at it or that it's necessarily my whole skill set. So yeah, I think that can be quite a difficult journey to navigate in terms of trying to find a job that recognizes the skills that you have and wants to use them, but doesn't over assume what you do have.
I like your term, a skills audit. Would you say that's like a tip that you would suggest, like someone does their own skills audit, and you might end up finding out you've actually kind of specialised anyway, given what you're doing, but you can really see like where your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and what you want to build and what you want to leave to the side. I don't know, but would you leave that as a tip?
Yes, I think so. It's something that we are trying to do we have a Digital Heroes volunteering kind of placement program where we're trying to put young people with digital skills with organizations that have skills gaps. And we ask when both the organizations and the young people are applying, for them to do a kind of skills audit where they rate how skilled they feel or how confident they feel in different areas of digital skills, so that we can try and match them in a way that makes sense and isn't doing that kind of over assuming that you just have all of the digital skills because you've said that you can do some digital things. And we're trying to make that at the moment, I think, more of a comprehensive way of doing that, so that nobody's ever asked too much of or asking too much of somebody, because that has previously, it can be an issue, and we would like to make sure that it's not.
It's really interesting to think of that placement as it's voluntary is still very general, focusing on a few general areas that they could help improve, or a special interest that they might have in a certain sector. But I think what is more long term and more potentially more long lasting is that idea of the career itself being quite specialized in learning those digital skills and sort of being not pigeonholed, but definitely expected to provide a certain level of digital literacy to your role, which does make it hard for you to break into those, higher sectors that we talked about, those curatorial and editorial ones. And I really hope that in the future there's a kind of a shift or a mindset change where people can realize that actually, there is space and there should be space for people who aren't interested in working on the digital side at all. And that's also equally fine. I really hope that's the case for young people in the future.
I was just going to add also, when looking to go into heritage and when we're on marketing and digital skills, I found actually quite a lot of the jobs were merged as well. So again, you're expected to be maybe a communication officer or marketing and then a content creator, which, I mean, for me personally, I quite like communications and I don't mind marketing. I quite like the data and the strategy side of it. But actually physically making content is something that I'm not experienced or comfortable. I'm not too sure, but it does give you that imposter syndrome, even for applying for these kind of jobs, if you're thinking you want to specialize in that. Yeah, and it's hard. And I guess and going back to some previous points, you just got to do what you're kind of interested in. And maybe sometimes, especially maybe do work experience or chatting to people about, the realistic day in the life of that job. I know sometimes work experience can be hard, especially if you want to take out time and it costs money and all sorts. But I think, yeah, even just having a chat to people or again, networking, and I think it is half of it is you're just at the right place at the right time.
Definitely. Yeah, something we completely haven't discussed is that kind of idea of freelancing or skipping between sort of short-term projects. I suppose that's something that you say yourself, like you have to do what you're interested in, really. And one of those ways to sort of influence that is by working in that freelance capacity, working on projects that might not have a long-term goal or a specific architectural role or research role at the end, but something that might be short term really interesting to you. Don't know if anyone has been involved on a freelance project at all. Darcie?
I did straight after I did an internship, which is another kind of short term kind of role where you're finding out lots of different things. And after that internship, where I met my current employer, who I didn't realize was going to be my current employer at the time, I did some freelance work for her. So that was kind of finding out about what she did in her role, and I was able to kind of trial if it was something I was actually interested in. So she got, some of my experience because it was on a specific kind of landscape case. So I was able to impart my knowledge, but also I was also able to kind of understand, oh, is this kind of sector of kind of being a historic environment consultant something I'm going to be interested in or not? And, it turned out I was, which is very kind of handy because then I was offered then a part-time role, which became full-time. So I think freelance in general is quite useful, and it's something that I'd never considered before. I didn't think it was viable, and I do think for a lot of the time it can be a bit of a tricky thing for a young person to pick up, because obviously it's reliant on you kind of going out there finding the work, and you've got to be in a position where you can sustain that work, and that's really hard. So I think it's something that if it comes up at a suitable time, maybe when you're doing a kind of part-time role, or you're maybe even like studying and figuring out what you want to do, and maybe there's a short-term kind of contract of 3 months or not even that, taking the opportunity or even just applying would be really good to see if it's something you're interested in and gain that experience. But obviously it's a tricky one because not everyone is in the position where they're able to do it as well. But I do think it's an area that has a lot of kind of potential for people to explore, and something, yeah, I didn't know was kind of an opportunity that I could have taken out of university, for example.
That's so interesting. Do you find that the role that you were on, the landscaping project, was that quite a specialist one then, or was it still fairly general?
So the knowledge, it's interesting. So the knowledge itself, I suppose, is specialized, but what I was doing for that role, so kind of assessing the significance of this walled garden, for example. So you write a report at the end, so you write a heritage statement. That's all things like research, and it's, undertaking a site visit, and it's all of those skills which you learn actually through studying that. If that was my route anyway, like learning it through kind of being at university, it's those kind of more general skills are kind of the basis for then my kind of niche, kind of specialized knowledge to sit on top of. So I did need those general skills, and I always do need those general skills in my current role, which I can then kind of link to my specialized knowledge to create kind of the job role that I'm in. So it's quite a balance of the two. And I think, to be honest, I think as we've kind of discussed, a lot of jobs will be like that. You need those kind of more quote unquote general skills in a lot of kind of the heritage worlds, I think. And then you kind of link on your individual specialism if that's something you decide. So yes, varied, I'd say, a bit of both.
I think also, and in a slightly different vein, going back to that kind of, we talked about how the path that you go down is that combination of skills and opportunities and networking and luck. And I think there's also a lot to be said for place in that. And I think that can be place in your career, but also like physical geographical place. And I know that there's a lot that you can feel like is excluded to you from being where you are. And sometimes moving can help and sometimes it doesn't. But things like, so for myself, I'm based in kind of rural Wales. And up until recently, I haven't been able to drive. And so, which in itself is a different skill set, but one that is very useful. And for me has now, it feels like opened more doors, or at least made the role I'm in significantly easier because I now have that access to transport and travel, and in a way that public transport infrastructure did not give me in the area that I live in. And I think there's also a lot to be said for kind of wider place in terms of, so Kate, you were talking about language earlier and how in Wales that skill is good and is very applicable, but in other places it might be seen as quite a specialism. And I think that's true of the skills that you have will be differently applicable in the area that you are in. And so there's also, and the opportunities that go with those skills will differ where you are as well. And so I think if you are looking to develop a skill set, you might want to look around and see where that will be best applied, or can be best applied, or can be best learned as well. Because there are things like, I was talking about apprenticeships earlier. Wales currently has a dearth, a really big lack of apprenticeships in a lot of areas that I know that other heritage organisations are trying to develop. I know that in Scotland and in England, they're currently trying to do more of those heritage skills, kind of craft skills, apprenticeships. And in Wales, we don't really have many of them. And the few that I know of are either ones that you have to do when you've already got a career, so it's like an on-the-job apprenticeship, which can be quite difficult, or are ones that are run through English establishments but maybe cross the border a little bit. And so that can be quite difficult in and of itself, and is a kind of sphere of different issues, but does really relate to that skills conversation, I think, and is something that needs to be considered as a factor if you're thinking about, the intersection of different things that make skill sets valued and valuable and useful and all of those different things. Place and context is very important. And I think if you are looking to specialise, it's worth doing that little bit of research and finding out, okay, well, where's the place? Where are those skills being hired? And where are the opportunities for that? And who do I need to talk to? Who's already operating that in that sphere that would maybe, by talking to them, I might pick up a little bit of knowledge or hear about more opportunities even, because that's something that I didn't realise until I got into the heritage sector, was being in the right places, talking to the right people, being there at the right time. They do all kind of coalesce into that sometimes perfect storm, sometimes terrible storm. I don't know. But that kind of, if you want to be varied, the more varied people you know, the more likely you are to hear about varied opportunities. The more places you go, the more likely you are to kind of hear. And it can be a privilege to, to be able to move, to be able to travel, to do all of those things. And it can be difficult not to, but even if and I think it's something that we do have an advantage of, is those digital spaces that bring together people from multiple areas and that can give you the opportunity to hear about those opportunities. It puts you in the room, so to speak, with people from many different areas with many different skills that you probably wouldn't be able to see all in person all at once anyway. I think the main points are kind of there, that I do think place and context are also important to skill sets, and how you use those to your advantage will also help you in what you're trying to achieve, whatever that is.
I would wholeheartedly agree. My entire educational and also professional career in heritage has basically just been multiple relatively large moves, me sort of following the dream, as it were. I grew up in Texas in the US, and the city that I grew up in, it's very much just, oh, you don't like it? Just tear it down, build something new kind of culture. And there are museums and there are historic sites, but there's not as many as you would think, given the size of the city that it is. And I did my undergrad, I got my bachelor's in Charleston, South Carolina, which it's not well known outside of the US. It's down on the East Coast by Florida. That's where I always tell people where it is to help point where the Carolinas are, because there's two of them and that can be confusing. And that does have a very strong historic presence, especially for historic tourism. And one of the reasons I decided to go to school there, even before I decided I wanted to get my degree in history, is I thought it would be cool to live there for a couple of years. And then that's where I worked, that's where I gained my initial experience. And in doing that, you sort of find out sort of what's the scope of the opportunities in this area. Like, again, like what Izzy was saying about, are these skills employable? Who's getting what kinds of jobs? Like, do you see growth? Do you see progression? And when I was looking at doing a master's, there were only a handful of schools in the entire United States that offered the kind of course that I wanted. And then so I started looking, well, what about the UK? Because I'd studied abroad in Ireland a couple of times doing my bachelor's. And there are dozens of schools in the UK that had the kind of course that I wanted to do. And I learned more about the heritage sector in the UK. And while it's not a perfect utopia, and it certainly has its challenges, there's so many more opportunities. There's so many more layers. The way in which it's integrated just into sort of the cultural landscape, people's relationship to it, it's much more actively valued, actively cherished than my experience growing up where I did in Texas, where it's literally just a tear it down and build something new every 20 years kind of place. So yeah, as someone who has made a move several thousand miles, first halfway across the country to the US, and then a move across an entire ocean, location does matter, and it's definitely worth, Google is your friend, and make use of that to sort of see where the opportunities are, see the paths in order for you to get there, and sort of weigh the costs versus the benefits. In my case, moving across an ocean, I have decided thus far is worth it, but we'll see if that changes.
Out of curiosity, your masters, so if you would move back to the US, would they see your masters as being very specialist? Because it maybe, I don't know what your course is like, but is it taking more from like the UK and sort of the UK teachings about that area of the field? So in the US, it's seen as very specialist, or is it quite broad, your masters, and it's applicable if you were to move back?
So I got my master's, my official title was World Heritage. And so it's basically, how do you run heritage sites? How do you work at them? What kinds of things do you consider? And then also with a specific focus on UNESCO World Heritage Sites, because that's one of the premier sort of global examples. That's an interesting question, actually. How would people in the US react? I guess it depends on which part of the US and what people in the US you're talking to, because nowadays it seems like the US is 2, 3, 4 different countries, depending on who you are and who you're speaking to. If I was in a city similar to Charleston, or typically these cities on the East Coast, because those parts of America have the most, what we in the Western world would consider sort of built heritage, because that's where Europeans first settled when they started coming over centuries ago. So in places like Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, D.C., people would not view it as foreign. It would be considered specialized, because I don't think there's a university in the entire country that offers a master's degree in World Heritage. There are a handful that do something like museum studies. But yeah, I think in those kinds of cities, people would understand. Outside of that, the heritage sector, it's just not as large, it's not as complex, it's not as layered. There are little pockets of the country, but the rest of the country, basically, when I go home, I usually have to explain to people what I got my master's in, what I did, and yes, I can have a career in that. Yes, I can be paid. There are all these different choices. In the UK, it's very different. And once I explain to people, they're like, wow, that's so cool. But it's not just sort of in sort of the common understanding over there as much as it is here, in my experience at least.
Yeah. I guess it must be, yeah, it's just a different mindset, I suppose. Someone told me a great quote, and it was like in America, 100 miles is seen as a short distance and 100 years is seen as a long time. And it's completely the opposite in the UK. And it's like, yeah, that definitely applies in certain cases. yeah, and it's just very impressive that you've traveled the world to sort of follow your passions. So, yeah, it's very admirable, Elizabeth, doing it that way. And yeah, very jealous because I'd have loved to have done your masters. It sounds great. Yeah, UNESCO is such an amazing area to explore.
Thank you. That's very sweet. I also want to acknowledge that not everybody has the time or the circumstances or resources to do what I've done. Not to minimize the hardships with moving. Immigration is not easy. People, Americans who live in other countries, they try to sort of like sugarcoat it by calling themselves expats, and it's like, no, no, no. It's immigration. That's what you do, and you have all the government backlogs and the fees and the applications and the this and the that, and it's no picnic. And I do give myself credit for being willing to do that and the uncertainty of it, but I know lots of people in the US, particularly in recent years, who would love to be able to do what I did, but they just don't have the time or the money to be able to do so. And I'm lucky that I have been able to make that work because not everybody can. And so, yeah, what Izzy was saying and what others have been saying about, it's not guaranteed and there is some uncertainty involved. And you do have to be proactive, whether it's physically like going to a location where you're more likely to find jobs or reaching out virtually. And not everybody is in a position where they're able to do that. And so it's important to be mindful of that. I try to be grateful for having the opportunity to try because not everyone can. And also just being honest, that way people know what they're getting into and they can weigh the benefits and the negatives, as it were.
Did you find that the World Heritage Masters was overly generalist when you were, obviously I'm imagining it was a fairly short course, so I'm wondering how much time you spent looking at sort of specific sites. I don't know if you have any input at all, Elizabeth.
No, there were times that I worried about it being overly generalized. But again, that kind of goes into that imposter syndrome where is there a better, more perfect path to get you to your goals? And ultimately, that's not necessarily true most of the time. It's a combination of education, experience, right place, right time, networking, meeting the right people. And it was this really weird combo, my course of like more sort of generalized, sort of general heritage management kind of theory. But then we would also do a lot of field trips, which were honestly what I enjoyed the most, where we would go to a lot of local sites. And I'm really lucky. I'm based in North Wales, which in addition to being one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to on the planet, there's a lot of like little nuggets and like little gems of heritage sites. And it seems like there's just one around every corner. We also have more quote unquote big ticket items, namely the UNESCO heritage site of the castles of King Edward I, because those are pretty famous and pretty well known, and for good reason. They're very cool castles. I still visit them from time to time because they're so interesting. But I got to go to a lot of these smaller towns, and I got to see how natural heritage is included in UNESCO's definition of World Heritage. But then we also visited sites that were not UNESCO affiliated at all, and it's like, how do smaller, more local sites do it? And meeting people in the field, recent graduates. I really have to give props to the program director because she really, really tried to deliver sort of good value for students on her course because she really wanted to set us up as best she could for success because she knows that it's tough out there. So really weird mix of generalized knowledge with specific case studies. And then she would encourage us in our assignments to draw our own conclusions and basically make the case for it about what kinds of decisions do you make in certain situations, because that's a lot of what heritage management jobs entail. And there's no one right answer. So to answer your question, parts of it were generalized, parts of it were not. It was kind of a big mix of everything.
Thank you. It's so interesting to hear about. I feel like it's very interesting how World Heritage sites can be so in their own sort of silos and not be super connected up. I actually had a conversation with somebody who looks after the World Heritage Site in the Lake District a couple of weeks ago, and they were very informative about how their site was, but couldn't tell much about how the general World Heritage legacy was and how the main sort of charitable aims were being fulfilled. It was very interesting because to me, they potentially have become so specialist, what seemed to quite a general career, that they actually couldn't provide so much knowledge on that more general side of, okay, well, what's the heritage management looking like in a broader scene? So yeah, very interesting kind of skill set to have such interesting knowledge about the lakes as a World Heritage Site and not so much about sort of the UK's wider role. But I don't know if you've ever had to look at that in your masters or if that wasn't something you're particularly covering.
We actually, I know I'm familiar with the heritage site you're talking about, and it just occurred to me that you talking about that, the best way to explain my degree is management of heritage sites, and sometimes we would look at that specifically through the UNESCO World Heritage Site model, and we would talk about the pros and cons, the goals of what that model is, but how often are those goals actually met, and what effect do these sites have on the local community? Does it isolate them? Are they integrated? I feel lucky and privileged to say that in North Wales, because the community is still so tight-knit, these sites that are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, so obviously the castle's one, and then more recently, the National Slate Landscape, all about the slate mining in North Wales, which has been fascinating to learn about. In this location, at least, the vibe that I get from the local community is UNESCO is very recently on the scene. These were our sites first, our places, our stories, our history, our folklore. UNESCO's come in now, and that's fine. We're happy to have them, but it's part of the wider fabric of the people that are privileged to call this place home. So that's been my experience here from on a local level. But what you're describing about it being sort of it serving to isolate some sites from on a national level because they're focusing on a global level, that is something that we discussed on my course.
Not to go off into a nerdy tangent, but I so would love to do a nerdy tangent on this. But I think in particular the North Wales, like the slate quarries and stuff like that, it is so, again, I haven't done your master's, so my argument could be completely against every current contemporary research in this field, but I would say that because it is so tied to like Welsh culture, particularly Northern Welsh culture, you are completely right in that there is already a foundation or a connection with the local community and the slate landscape up in North Wales. It is absolutely gorgeous as well. It's almost an alien landscape depending on how, times of year, weather, etc. You can see why places like House of Dragons film up in North Wales for some of the Game of Thrones stuff. But yeah, because it's so tied to sort of Welsh history and culture, I think, yeah, you're right that the locals have already connected to it in a way, and that UNESCO is a cherry on the top. But it really is that. It's just an additional benefit. And it brings Wales to the wider world, which, we love to sort of shout out about as well, because I think me and Izzy would both say we're quite patriotic Welsh people. And we want, it can be more sidelined than other places in the UK, which is completely not fair. And we just love to shout out about our beautiful landscapes when we can.
No, 1,000%, everything you said. Yeah, again, not trying to go off on a tangent here, so I'll just leave it with this one statement. However my journey here in the UK works out, it will have been worth it to be able to pursue my dream in heritage, but specifically to do it in one of the most unique and special places on this earth. And I just talking about patriotism, like I wasn't born here and I'm not Welsh and I'm not trying to co-opt any identities, but like I do feel patriotic about it. I'm just Wales forever.
Yeah. We'll adopt you. You can be an adopted Welshie.
I think that's absolutely in the spirit of it as well. I think that should be how you feel about where you live and the heritage of it. And like, I wouldn't want to exclude anybody from saying they're Welsh because they haven't been here for as long or whatever. I think that's. But then I also did my master's dissertation on very specifically national identity in Wales, and how it relates to place identity within the national park that I live in. So how people feel related to their landscape and how that makes them feel Welsh. So that's something that I could very much go on a nerdy, probably very long rant about, or not rant, but just tangent, and would get very excited about. But I won't do that because I feel like we have gone down a Wales rabbit hole, and I don't want to.
Oh, but I love a Wales rabbit hole.
But other nations do exist and do also have great heritage, and you can build your skills in other places too. So now we're going to kind of round off the episode by just each giving a little tip or a piece of advice or something that we found particularly useful in maybe developing our own skills or that we think will be useful for developing yours.
So I'll start. Like I said earlier, there's no one perfect path into the heritage sector, with the exception of a very few very specialized roles. It's going to take a combination of education, knowledge, experience, networking, also just pure luck, being in the right place at the right time for people who are hiring your specific skill set. Google is your friend. Do some light research into the skills that are employable and marketable, but also keep in mind that because of the nature of the heritage field, it's very people focused. It's all about sharing people's perspectives, past, present, and hopefully future. So don't feel like you have to sort of completely conform to what you think they want, because part of what makes you unique, your own little secret sauce, is what's going to help you to succeed.
I love that. And I think leading on from that is kind of saying, don't worry about saying yes to a role which isn't, in air quotes, the perfect role or what you thought you might have been doing, or it's not quite the perfect match, because I think, as we've discussed throughout this podcast, you can get so much more than what's just on the surface level of the job description. You can get a lot more out of the role, even if it's just kind of closely not closely, sorry, linked to what you might want. So I think just have a broad mind and see what opportunities can get you.
Yeah, it's really interesting saying about having a broad mind and really opening your own kind of field to look what options are out there. I think for me, my advice would be that as you go through careers and various options, your vision might change of if you want to be specialist or if you would prefer to be general. For example, even if you're moving from a different industry into the sector, there could be a chance for you to start off extremely specialized. But if you're interested in the role itself, I think that any kind of generalization or specialization, it won't matter to you if you're really involved and passionate by the role. So yeah, I think letting yourself grow and develop over time and not necessarily pinning yourself to one specialist career is going to be really helpful in terms of a longer term sort of fulfilling, personally happy role.
I think my tip would be have a look, like someone said earlier, do some Google research, look at heritage-based website and see what the current trends are within those industries and within those different sectors. You can see what the sort of those hot skills are going to be in the future and will get increasingly more important. And if you can find opportunities in order to develop your skills in that area, that puts you at an advantage in things like interviews and applying for different jobs, particularly entry ones, and doing your own sort of skills audit as well, so you can see what it is that you can bring to the table. It means you identify your strengths, but also like areas to work on, and that could be specialist or general skills.
I think my advice would be, I think, gently push yourself to try new skills. And I think especially maybe skills you not uncomfortable or you're a bit worried about doing, to say, maybe for me it's like public speaking or something like that. That means you hold you back doing, maybe applying for a role or opportunity. But I think it's just important that just to go for it, and you never know might what happen. And I think also, like everyone else has said, if you don't like something, or your life can change and you can do different options. So I think that would be our advice.
I think my piece of advice is quite similar to the rest of you, and it's kind of that thing of don't assume that because you've built a certain set of skills that that excludes you from building other skills or developing a different idea of what you want to do. And in the same way, but the opposite direction, don't assume that because you don't have skills that you won't be able to do something. It's always very worth trying something, and there's trying and failing is not always a bad thing. And it can sometimes teach you as much as it stops you from developing skills if you need. It can help you build that resilience, which in itself is a skill, but it can also teach you new things that you maybe didn't know about yourself. It can teach you that maybe the path that you thought you wanted to go down is not actually the path that you want to do at all, and the skills that you thought you wanted to develop are maybe not for you. And in the other way, it can teach you that maybe something you thought you wouldn't like is actually something that you really love. And so just, yeah, not ruling things out because you either think that you do have the skills to do it or that you don't have the skills to do it is important. And yeah, it goes back to what Darcie was saying about having that kind of broader mind of what you should be doing. Don't pigeonhole yourself unless you really want to be a pigeon in that hole. Not my most profound phrase, but
I love it.
I love that.
a
Yeah.
good one
It's
to
a
end
good
on.
one to end the
Yeah.
podcast on.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Brick by Brick, a podcast by the Heritage Network's Youth Forum. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode on skill sets and whether or not you should develop skills that are more generic or more specific.